As many of you will know, at Wide Angle Lunches, we aim to keep ourselves in touch with the latest in historical research, cultural affairs, and international goings-on, just as the founders of the Library Society did in 1748. I think then the key challenge that they were facing was their distance from London, the publishing centre. Today we don't mind being far from London, although I occasionally do when I try and buy flights. But the bigger challenge for us is sort of information overload, rushed lunches, work pressure, juggling family and professional life. And so here at Wide Angle Lunches, we want you to leave your troubles outside, switch off your mobile phones, settle in and enjoy a delicious lunch from the Black Bean Company from Spring Street, and tune in to our speaker of the day. I'd like to thank Faye Jensen and the South Carolina Historical Society. Without their support, we would not have been able to fly Julie Flavell in all the way from, Dundee in Scotland, in fact. And so we're very grateful for the partnership with the Historical Society. And any profits from today will be split with them, so you know that your money is going towards two good causes. I'd also like to thank the Bank of South Carolina and Hugh Lane for underwriting today's lunch. We're hugely, there he is, yes, hugely grateful for your support and for this project, so thank you very much. One last thing before I introduce our speaker. Next week's talk is on Thursday, the 7th of April, and the speaker is Jack McRae, who many of you will know from the pages of the Post and Courier and from his emceeing of various jazz events around Charleston. And if you have seen him or read him, you'll know what a charismatic man he is and what a fantastic speaker. And I'm very excited to hear him putting Charleston firmly on the map of America's musical history. And now to Julie Flavell. Dr. Flavell is a remarkable woman. Like many of the characters in the book that so many of you have read, she is an American who has chosen to settle across the pond with all the challenges that involves. While raising a family in Scotland, she has forged such a strong reputation in the field of Anglo-American 18th century studies that she was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society in 1999. And as a Brit, I can say that that is a massive achievement, alongside, of course, her PhD from University College London and her undergraduate degree from Bryn Mawr College. The fact that when London was capital of America is largely about Charlestonians is partly due to the hard work and organisation of Henry Lawrence, who kept extremely detailed files of his correspondence, which are now in the Historical Society. And we could say it's sort of thanks to him that Julie's book about London was able to be so focused on Charleston and South Carolinians. And that gave us the perfect excuse to tempt her over to Charleston to speak to us. And we're really delighted that despite the huge demands on her time, both personal and professional, that she took our invitation up. So thank you very much, Julie, and please welcome.
Very much, and thank you to everybody for coming today. I'm really thrilled to be in Charleston for the first time. I learned a lot about Charleston writing my book and researching the people who lived here over 200 years ago. And so in some ways it came alive to me, but I was really, really thrilled to get a chance to actually come and see these places that I've read so much about, and really to be able to identify more deeply with the people I wrote about. Now, what I'm going to do today.
Speak up a little bit.
Okay, you're having trouble hearing at the back. Okay, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start out by explaining the concept behind my book as I originally imagined it. And then I'm going to tell one or two central stories from the book, depending on how much time we have. Now the original, can everyone hear? Yes?
You're not on mic.
Okay. Okay. Right, how's that? Can everyone hear now?
Yeah.
Okay. The original idea for my book was that I wanted to write a travel history based around the experiences of colonial Americans in London in the 15 years or so before the American Revolution. And the reason I felt this group would be particularly interesting, there were actually more colonial Americans in London just before the American Revolution than there were for the entire rest of the colonial period beginning in 1607. And historians frequently use the kinds of comparisons, comments that people make in travel writing to make comparisons between people from different nations and uncover national character. And I wanted to use the letters and diaries of American colonists in London at this time to explore just how different Americans were from the British people just at this very interesting point when they were about to become a separate nation. So the idea of this was to do a cultural rather than a political look at Americans in London at this time. There have been a lot of political studies. So I went to these letters and diaries expecting to find a wealth of material. And I presumed that particularly at this time when there was a lot of tension between Britain and the colonies, that Americans visiting London would be very outspoken about what they found there and particularly what they didn't like. And instead, I met the usual fate of a scholar who goes to the sources expecting to find what she's looking for. Because instead there was an entire absence of tourist remarks, the usual sort of tourist remarks in the letters and diaries of these people. And it was a silence that showed that they found London a familiar place. They weren't at all like European foreigners coming into London at that time who routinely commented on clothes, manners, food. Instead, they were clearly taking a lot of what they saw for granted. And in fact, colonial Americans coming into London just before the Revolution, the best comparison in my mind is Americans perhaps from someplace like Ohio going into New York City in the early 19th century. London was for them the big city, with all the differences that a big city involves, but it was still their city. It was their capital city. So I didn't give up there. I decided to take a closer look at this group in London and use another method of looking at cultural differences between two groups. And this is a method that relies more on actions than on words. So I borrowed the methods of social scientists who study the adjustment of incoming groups by using a set of categories that indicate levels of integration. And in order to do this, I made a database of Americans living in London at this time that gave a profile of the colonial American community in London just before the Revolution, its size, the different types of Americans who were coming there, where they lived, who they knew, what their occupations were, and as far as I could, what lifestyles they followed. And my subject suddenly became much bigger because I discovered that there were even more Americans in London than were previously thought, that instead of numbering them in the hundreds, they were numbered in thousands at this time. Let's see. Okay. There was a social geography to where colonial Americans were found in their capital city. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. In the West End here, around the Royal Parks, I just pointed out, I'm afraid people won't be able to hear. In the West End, around the Palace of St. James and the Royal Parks, lived the Southern planters who came in entire households and brought slaves with them, because these were the rich new housing developments that were springing up in London and were near the palace and where the aristocracy lived. Yankee merchants were more likely, we have the city, there's an old Roman city wall. Yankee merchants were more likely to be found in the city because that's where business was conducted, and Yankees tended to come on their own in order to do business. London was a very expensive place to visit. So they often came on so-called flying visits, and by the 18th century standards, that meant spending a month getting there, and a month living there and doing business, and a month coming back. So that's a flying visit by 18th century standards. The record for crossing was 3 weeks from Boston to London. Now, black and white American merchant sailors disembarked at the Tower docks. Would you be here? That's where the most important docking was in London at this time. Black and white merchant sailors disembarked there and strolled about the taverns and usually took lodgings in the cheap East End of London. At the Temple in Fleet Street, which is right around there, okay. At the Temple and around Fleet Street, you would find the wealthy sons of planters and people from New York and Pennsylvania, great Atlantic merchants who came there to study law. Okay, and they wandered around the taverns trying to get a glimpse of Dr. Johnson and his literary club. And they also, I found, often brought with them enslaved servants, and there was even a minor student slave trade going on in Fleet Street at that time. And at Charing Cross, here we go, okay, in that area there. At Charing Cross, which was near Whitehall, where the government buildings still are, and St. Martin's School of Art, which was the premier school for studying art at that time, lived the lobbyists, agents, and artists. These were Americans who came to London for professional reasons, and that's where the two most famous colonial Americans living there at that time had their homes, and that was Benjamin Franklin and the artist Benjamin West. Now, each of these parts of town, with their resident Americans, became a section of my book. And for each one, I selected a few individuals whose stories take the reader through all of it. And most of these individuals had a great deal to say about themselves one way and another in their letters and their diaries. But that wasn't true for one very significant colonial group, and that was the American slaves who were coming to London in ever greater numbers at this time. Typically, they were coming in with their masters on their trip to London. And my biggest challenge in writing the book was to find a way to tell their story. And I was only able to do it because of one unusually outspoken, complaining slave owner, and Caroline's already mentioned his habit of letter writing. Oh, sorry. That was Henry Lawrence. Henry Lawrence of South Carolina. Now, I feel a bit embarrassed introducing him to this particular audience, but just in case people don't know who he was, he was a rice planter who lived in Charleston and in the countryside here, and he had 5 plantations and hundreds of slaves. And he was a man with a very strong personality who saw himself as a devoted husband and father. And he also saw himself as a very humanitarian man, despite the fact that part of his fortune was built on the slave trade. And Henry salved his conscience, as it were, about this by cherishing the belief that on his own plantations, the slaves were as happy as it was possible to make them. And in fact, in a letter to Alexander Hamilton, he wrote, "I will venture to say the whole are in more comfortable circumstances than any equal number of peasantry in Europe." And that was actually a very important concept for American planters who visited Europe, because they did see there weren't really big city slums in America at this time. So they saw the London slums. They saw the way that some of the estate laborers lived on British estates. And they did have the opinion that in a lot of cases, slave quarters on plantations were better places to be. So it was something they liked to say a lot. Now, it's thanks to Henry's robust self-image and his habit of constant letter writing, which fills up, I don't know how much of the South Carolina Historical Society now, that I was able to unearth the story of an American slave's adventures in London. And this was Scipio, Henry's body servant, who came to London with him in 1771 when Henry took his 3 sons to London for their education. And this was a typical thing for wealthy Carolinians to do at the time. There were at least 50 South Carolina families living in London just before the Revolution. And this was in no way relevant to which side they were going to take once the American Revolution began, whether they were going to become loyalists or patriots. All of them wanted to come to London to educate their children and bring their children up to London standards of gentility. Anyone who wanted to seem well-bred, even if he was stepping forward to sign the Declaration of Independence, wanted to do it according to the standards of a London drawing room. So along came the Lawrences, and with them came Scipio. And Henry recalled later that Scipio actually negotiated his inclusion in the Lawrence entourage. He came to Henry with 10,000 promises of good behavior, Henry remembered. I brought him to England in consequence of his own entreaties, that he should not be so well used if I left him behind me. So, why did Scipio want to go so badly? Was it really out of loyalty to Henry Lawrence? Well, just like their wealthy white overlords, slaves in South Carolina knew that London was a great place to go. Returning slaves from London also told stories, just as they were told in the drawing rooms, and some of them even acquired their own metropolitan polish. This is a picture. It's a cartoon, but it's meant to be based on a real person named Julius Soubise. He was a Jamaica slave, and he was owned by the Duchess of Queensberry. And he was a great favorite of hers, as you can probably see. And in fact, she not only dressed him well, she gave him an expense account, and he threw dinner parties. So, and slaves did sometimes come back to South Carolina with, fancy, stylish clothes on. So Scipio knew that London was a place he wanted to go to too. And when the Lawrences reached England, he also asked Henry permission to change his name from Scipio to Robert. And Henry made only the barest mention of this in a letter home when they disembarked at Falmouth. He wrote, "Robert, sometime Scipio, is well, and promises fair to continue good and dutiful." So he made light of this, but Robert's request shows that he had been doing some thinking for himself, and that back in South Carolina, he'd been warned that Londoners made fun of the kind of classical names given to house slaves in Carolina, names like Pompey, Caesar, and Scipio. So it's clear that Robert anglicized his name because he wanted to get on in London. Now, Robert Scipio is the only person I wrote about in the book who never spoke in his own words. And his story is told almost incidentally from the Henry Lawrence letters. And Henry Lawrence normally just mentioned Robert as an aside, that Robert went and did this and that for me. But he sometimes complained about Robert. And in my experience, it's rare for a master to discuss his servant so frequently. And Robert's story has only survived because of Henry's outspoken personality, and also, I think, his relationship with Robert, which had a particular significance in Henry's mind. Robert was a favorite, and as a favorite, he played an important role in feeding Henry's illusions that his slaves were contented and didn't want their freedom. But taking Robert to London was really going to put this to the test, because there were no slave codes in London, and it also really wasn't possible to carry out the plantation system of discipline that was used to keep slaves in their place back home. And once they reached England, Henry and Robert became locked in the sort of power struggle that went on between many American masters and their slaves while they were in London. But their particular struggle would come to a surprising and unusual ending. And because I only have Henry's word for what happened, I had to try to uncover Robert's feelings and his motives by recreating the physical environment and the social environment that he encountered when he was in London, so that I could try to recreate his mindset. And this process played a very important part for me in understanding his side of the story. Now, of course, it's easy to find out how London looked to white colonists who went there, but what I needed to do was to reconstruct how it might look to a black house servant who went there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read out a passage from my book in which I imaginatively reconstructed what Robert saw as he went from Fludyer Street. This is Fludyer Street. This is where Henry Lawrence lived. It's right next to Downing Street, but don't try to go there because it's gone, unfortunately. And you can see St. James's Park just through the gates there. I'm going to reconstruct what Robert saw as he went from Fludyer Street on daily errands for Henry, whether into the city, near the Bank of England, or across St. James's Park and into the wealthy houses around Oxford Street where Henry's friends lived. And in order to reconstruct this, I had to draw upon a huge range of sources: letters, architectural history, social history, and even literature. And in one case, I took my inspiration from a recent novel about West Indians coming into London just after World War II. And that particular book, a passage in it, helped me to understand the meaning of an 18th century complaint that slaves in London learn here to despise the whites. Out and about, running errands for Henry Laurens, Robert must have quickly learned his way around the great city. From Fludyer Street to the Carolina Coffee House, with a message for Mr. Stead or Mr. Brailsford, would take him past the most famous landmarks of Georgian London. Down Whitehall he would go, past the government buildings and banqueting house where Charles I was executed. From thence his route took him to the Strand, where stood old Somerset Palace, a Renaissance royal residence. Then through Temple Bar to Fleet Street, with its law scholars, pubs, and winding lanes, and on to St. Paul's Cathedral, the defining feature of Georgian London's skyline. From here, the merchant coffee houses were just a short distance away. Taking a message to Berners Street was another adventure altogether, as it took one through St. James's Park and the elegant, decorous squares of the new West End. Robert's errands would leave him plenty of time to explore independently, away from his master's scrutiny, because Henry reckoned that it took 2 to 3 hours for a servant to deliver a message from Fludyer Street to the city and return with a reply. Back in the colonies, there was nothing equal to what Robert saw. What buildings, what monuments, what dress, display, and equipage. The townhouses and the plantations of the Carolina rich only gave a foretaste of the reality. But at the same time, what poverty, what deprivation. Even the slave quarters at home probably did not prepare him for what he encountered on his solitary perambulations through the great city. What he saw were some of the poorest white people in the empire, degraded, half-starved, stinking and desperate, stripped of all dignity, people whose condition was enough permanently to change his idea of the white race. They learn here to despise the whites. So wrote a West Indian planter of the plantation slaves who were brought to London. How would London's poorest look to one who was unused to the sight of white people at the bottom of the barrel? Andrea Levy, in her novel Small Island, conjures up the shock that black West Indians experienced when they came to Britain during the Second World War, using terms that suggest what Robert might have felt a century and a half earlier. The West Indian RAF volunteers arrived in the land they called their mother country, a place they had known from afar as refined, mannerly, and cultured, to find that mother has a blackened eye, bad breath, and one lone tooth that waves in her head when she speaks. They shook their heads at the first long look at England. It was the squalid shambles that made them frown so. They wondered how so many white people come to speak so bad, low class and coarse as cane cutters. They marveled at white women who worked hard on the railway, swinging their hammers and picks like the strongest man. They saw the English slum children, white urchin faces blackened with dirt, dried snot flaking on their mouths. They saw white women in public wearing worn-out, undersized clothes. It was this that worried the West Indian planter of Robert's day, the revelation of a white underclass that eroded the slave's terror of his masters, giving him new and enlarged notions of the weaknesses of whites. That was what one planter wrote about it. The deference to the white race that was deliberately cultivated in plantation slaves would be gone forever. Even in Whitehall, the Strand, and Fleet Street, the main arteries of the city that Robert knew well, the very poor and the desperate were everywhere in evidence. Right around the corner from Fludyer Street in King Street, there was a cook shop where unskilled kitchen help worked for food only. The basket woman who carried loads in Fleet Market just off Fleet Street worked for the same wages. They were not unknown to starve to death. Thin, worn, and humble, the people who lived these hand-to-mouth existences would have made a sharp contrast in Robert's eyes to those who chose to beg or thieve instead. Georgian London still had the sturdy beggars of the days of Henry VIII, fantastic, ragged figures who deliberately created open sores on their faces to arouse the sympathy of passers-by. The stocks at Charing Cross were on Robert's way to the Carolina Coffee House. In the pillories, petty criminals were pelted with filth and rocks and humiliated by a jeering mob. London had more prostitutes than any city in Europe, and on the Strand, girls as young as 12 solicited passers-by. And the children of London's poorest set to work as mindless drudges in apprenticeships that amounted to virtual slavery, would routinely pass through the Lawrences' neighborhood. The maids who cried milk and the chimney sweeps all grew up in abject ignorance, not even taught housework, taken on by masters who hoped the value of their labor would amount to more than the cost of their food and clothes. Chimney sweeps needed to be very small, so they started young, sometimes as early as 5 years. When their masters did not bother to wash the coal dust off them for 3 to 4 years, they succumbed to a form of skin cancer. They were literally used up. White trash. The term was not used in Robert's world, but the destitute of London were indeed treated as refuse by their countrymen. The social reformers of the Georgian era were still only lone voices crying in the wilderness. Robert Lawrence, like the other plantation slaves he knew in London, was a significant cut above these portionless folk. The fact was that with all its poverty and racism, London was an empowering place for Robert. So even as an unfree black footman, Robert's status was suddenly elevated above that of the poorest whites he saw in London. There were no slave codes. The white servants were surprisingly uninhibited about accepting blacks among their ranks, even enslaved blacks. And there were job opportunities for trained black house servants. In fact, there was a vogue in Georgian London for black footmen. So if Robert wasn't contemplating getting his freedom before he left South Carolina, he probably was soon after he reached London. And from the start, Robert was continually doing things that Henry didn't like, barely earning his own bread, according to Henry. What really bothered Henry was that Robert was continually getting money. Henry said in several places, money does him no good, and I have to guess what that means. Henry had no way to prevent this because there was a very well-established custom of tipping servants continually in London. And in fact, it was such an established custom that there were a couple of public campaigns to stamp it out because it was considered to be an unfair tax on the upper classes. Now, London servants were supposed to be impudent and uncontrollable, and the reasons assigned were that they had too much money, and a lot of that had to do with this tipping, and of course too many things to spend it on. The theater, Vauxhall Gardens, servants went to these regularly, and there were even pubs that were dedicated servant hangouts in London where you would only meet other servants for the most part. And in fact, by Henry's account, all this had an effect on Robert, because within a couple of months, Robert had been corrupted by his fellow servants in Flavell Street. Now, Henry Lawrence was a workaholic who worked a 20-hour day, and he liked to get up early in the morning. But Robert quickly picked up the London habit of sleeping late. And Henry wrote to a friend, "The universal practice here of sitting up late at night and rising late in the morning obliged me to be confined many hours when I would gladly have been employed in writing or walking abroad. The servants, even my black servant, would all comply with the fashion. If I quitted my bed, it must be to starve in a cold room. The only alternative, therefore, was to lay still and be quiet." And it's a striking picture, isn't it, of powerlessness in the face of servant solidarity. Here's this man, this wealthy, powerful man, even a slave owner, who can't get Robert or any of the servants to just get up and give him breakfast and light a fire. And this was the sort of behavior that London servants were notorious for. So inevitably, things came to a head. Within 6 months of arriving in London, Robert and Henry had some sort of confrontation, which left Henry temporarily on top again. And Henry wrote, "Robert behaved a little amiss one day, and Henry decided to call his bluff. He told Robert, if he did not choose to stay with me, to go about his business. Robert said he would serve nobody else, and has behaved excellently well ever since." Now, Henry claimed that in the course of this confrontation, Robert had said that Negroes that want to be free here are fools. Now, Robert may have said that, but he couldn't have meant it, because right around the corner on Flavell Street at that time, there was a landmark civil rights case going on called the Somerset trial. And this involved a slave named James Somerset, who was challenging his master's right to forcibly return him to the colonies. So the trial wasn't over whether slavery was legal in England, as many people assume, but just that one point, whether a master could forcibly return his slave to the colonies. Now, this case was shortly going to be decided in Somerset's favor, but like all laws or legal decisions, it was just a piece of paper unless it was enforced. And within a few months of the Somerset decision, Henry Lawrence was flouting British law by assisting in the abduction of a slave named Cato back to the colonies. Now, Cato's master was George Austen, who was an English friend of Henry's, who had a country home in Shropshire, England, but he had lived in South Carolina. And my guess is that in the wake of the Somerset decision, Cato was talking a little too freely about deserting his master, because there were a lot of masters in England complaining right after the Somerset decision that their slaves were suddenly thinking that they were free. But Henry personally supervised this business. He helped to bundle Cato into a closed carriage and got him onto a ship in the Thames, bound for South Carolina. So Robert, who saw all of this, was wise to agree with Henry when he said that slaves who wanted their freedom were fools. If Robert had taken Henry at his word, I have no doubt that he would have found himself bundled aboard a ship in the Thames. And despite the absence of slave codes and the Somerset decision, it wasn't really going to be that easy for Robert to escape from Henry in London. In London, there were professional slave catchers who were paid to go out and find escaped slaves, and they made a living that way and recapture them. And although it was in a kind of a legal twilight that this went on, nothing was done about it. And even if Robert evaded the slave catchers, he could end up starving to death in the streets of London. People regularly did starve to death in Georgian London if they had no friends and nowhere to go. And as a slave from the plantations wouldn't qualify for parish relief. So this time, Henry's brinkmanship had succeeded, but inevitably things went back to the old ways. And eventually, Henry got a bit fed up, I think, and he got into the habit of banishing Robert for long periods of time to Mr. Austen's house in Shropshire, and here it is, still standing. It's being divided into apartments now, of course, but I got the owner to take this picture for me. So Henry would banish Robert out here, I think, because to get a bit of peace. And this was where the final act of the whole drama took place, because in February 1774, Robert was arrested in the act of burglarizing Aston Hall, as it's called. And Henry was absolutely beside himself with rage when he heard. He wrote, "Foolish, rascally Robert." But by this time, the whole thing had gone beyond his control. It was reported in the local newspaper, the Shrewsbury Chronicle, and Robert was in jail. So, was Henry finally ready to give up on Robert? He couldn't fool himself anymore that Robert was happy in his service. It was clear that Robert wanted out. But Henry wasn't ready to give up, and I think he really never would have been ready to accept that Robert wanted his freedom. And he thought about it, and he decided that there might be a way to keep Robert in slavery. In Georgian England, you could get hanged for very minor thefts, but it was more likely that for a minor theft such as Robert's, he just stolen a gammon ham and a few other things, that he would get the sentence of transportation to the colonies. And Henry worked out that if that happened, he could go to the Crown officials and offer to pay for the transportation rather than it being at the Crown's expense, in which case, of course, Robert would return to the Lawrence plantation and to slavery. And Henry had known other planters who'd done this. The burglary was probably connected with a bid for freedom on Robert's part, because one of the things Henry mentioned, which I can't find much about this, but Henry alluded to a scheme on Robert's part to marry a local Shropshire girl. And sometimes enslaved people in Britain did use marriage as a way of getting out of being brought back home. And so probably he needed money to do this. So basically, I think Robert was always looking for a way out from early on, from his arrival in London. But for once, his initiative had landed in someplace where he didn't want to be. And for a month, he languished in a Shropshire jail waiting for his trial. And during that time, the Lawrence family changed his name, or he may have changed it himself, I'm not sure, but his name was changed to John Morton. And I think this was to protect the Lawrence family's privacy. A lot of families, nothing to do with simply being a slave owner, a lot of families didn't like their names being dragged through the courts in Georgian England. So his name was changed to John Morton. Morton's a village right near Aston in Shropshire, so I think that may be where his name came from. That was a common thing. But the outcome of the trial wasn't at all what Henry expected, because instead of being hanged or transported, Robert was sentenced to a year in prison. So actually, this was a fantastic stroke of luck for Robert, because he finally got himself someplace where Henry couldn't get him. He was detained at His Majesty's pleasure, and Henry had to return to the colonies. He returned to the colonies that autumn. The American Revolution was going to begin soon, and Henry would take a leading part in it. Henry never mentioned Robert again in his letters under any of his names. Now, because of that, unlike the other characters in my book, Robert pretty much disappears from the pages of history once Henry drops him. But I was thrilled to find him one last time in the trials of the Old Bailey in 1777. It wasn't that Robert was out on trial. He brought a woman before the magistrates for robbing him. And just for once, the story was told in Robert's own words. So I want to give a chance to give him a voice. John Morton, a black, testified, "I came from High Wycombe to see after a place. I was disappointed of the place and did not know where to go for a lodging. And according to Robert, the defendant, Mary Slug, offered him a place to sleep in exchange for his handkerchief. But when he woke up in the morning, his waistcoat, knife, and silver hatband were all gone. There were some women there in the morning," testified Robert. "They laughed at me. I saw the prisoner at the door about 2 hours after and took her up." So this is the Robert as I come to, the sort of character Robert appeared to me in the book, and the way I'd come to know him. He was a gregarious, competent man. Mary Slug was found guilty and sentenced to a whipping, and Robert disappeared from the historical record forever. But 2 years after he was released from jail, we know that he was in London, he was wearing clothes that were fit for a servant's position, and he was looking for work, and he was free. Now for Londoners, the Lawrence household, that is Henry, his 3 sons, and Robert, were the typical Americans. Wealthy Southern planters with slaves stood out in the streets in a way that ordinary colonists did not. And people were, in any case, much more aware of the mixed-race colonies of the southern mainland and the West Indies than they were of the northern colonies and New England. They saw plantation products everywhere in the street, sugar, tobacco, rum. They were regularly advertised and sold. There were a growing number of blacks in the streets of London that were a constant reminder of the labor force that underpinned these products. And probably for that reason, a lot of ordinary Englishmen in Georgian England had a vague impression of the American colonies as a land of nothing but slave compounds and white slave drivers, just all the way along. A lot of that was because they didn't know much about the colonies, but the West Indies was also America until 1776, when people referred to Americans. They also meant West Indians at that time. Now this was frustrating that Londoners and Georgian Englishmen had this impression of America as just a land of slave plantations, but for some white Americans, it was more than that. And Bostonian James Otis, who was one of the Massachusetts Sons of Liberty, wrote a pamphlet addressed to an English audience on colonial liberties, and in it, addressing the English readership, he lectured, "You think most, if not all, the colonists are Negroes and mulattoes. You are wretchedly mistaken. 99 in 100 in the northern colonies are white, and there is as good blood flowing in their veins, save the royal blood, as any in the 3 kingdoms." But Otis lectured in vain, because whatever misconceptions Londoners might have about life in the colonies, and they did have many, they did know that Americans themselves were a colonial, multiracial people. They were direct spin-offs of Britain's 18th century trading empire. They were English, Scottish, Irish, European, and African. And most Georgian Englishmen, if they were asked to conjure up a picture of a typical American, would undoubtedly picture a white plantation owner with a slave at his heels rather than Thomas Jefferson's beloved homespun farmer. But of course, there were Yankees in London too. In the 18th century, New Englanders didn't have the reputation for being sober embodiments of Republican virtue that they'd claimed for themselves after the American Revolution. In fact, New England was supposed to be a land of fanatically religious Puritans who, when they weren't being sanctimonious, were supposedly thinking about how to drive a hard bargain. And this wasn't only the opinion of fashionable Londoners, because American colonists from New York and southward also thought that of New Englanders. And in fact, John Adams admitted when he went to the First Continental Congress and met the elites from other colonies that New Englanders seemed awkward and bashful, he said, coming across as pert, ostentatious, and vain, a mixture which excites ridicule and gives disgust. And he did comment that he thought some of the reason was that Southerners got out and about and traveled, and New Englanders definitely didn't do much of that. So what impact did this have on the experiences of New Englanders in the capital city? The evidence is that in London, New Englanders often did look rustic, and in fact there are anecdotes of New Englanders being mistaken for servants in polite society in London. But however rustic they might be, I think I'm going to have to finish up here, aren't I? They couldn't be told apart from equally rustic Englishmen who came in from the countryside. Okay, particularly Yorkshiremen. New Englanders were sometimes compared to Yorkshiremen in the 18th century. Their accents wouldn't give them away, because although colloquial American accents were emerging at this time, there's no evidence that Londoners could identify them. There were a huge number of English dialects spoken, and I've never had a single instance of an American, wherever they're from, coming into a London shop and someone saying, "Oh, you're from America, I can tell." So I think even if they had a Yankee twang, the shopkeeper would just assume it was one of these country accents he hadn't heard before. So the fact is that New Englanders and other white Americans seemed English in the streets of London. In fact, wealthy colonists like the Lorens were said to have cultivated English accents in the 18th century. And so Mel Gibson had the wrong accent in The Patriot. Okay, I wanted to tell about one New Englander, a man named Stephen Sayre. I'm not sure I'm going to have much time to do this. And he's a character who is an exception that proves the rule, because he came from a Long Island farming family. His family were originally from Massachusetts, and he had a homespun background, but his father sent him to Princeton because he was the youngest and clever. He went to work for a New York merchant, and then he went to London on a business trip in 1762, and he was entranced by what he found. And he wrote to a friend, "I can't bear the thoughts of living in America or starving in England." And this became his mantra. So what Sayre wanted, he wasn't interested in London business opportunities. He wanted to live the life of a gentleman in London, but of course he didn't have the money. So he had to employ fraudulent methods. And one of the things he needed to do was drop all his New England rusticity. But that was something that people with a knack of imitation could do, because London was full of 18th century Eliza Doolittles and their male counterparts who learned to appear like members of the upper class. Do you want me to?
Well, I know that there may be questions. Perhaps if there aren't, we carry on. But it's so fascinating. I don't want to interrupt you, but we do like to end at past.
All right, I'll read a short. I was going to read a short passage from my book, describing the London world of charlatans who posed as gentlefolk at this time, that Stephen Sayre would have seen, and it would have made it possible for him to pull off the kinds of things he did, which I won't be able to tell you about in detail. Genteel manners were a cheap accessory for those who had the knack of imitation. If you could perfect your manners and acquire a good suit of clothes, it was very difficult for people to guess your social status. That opened up a window of opportunity for those who were sharp enough to take advantage of it. In a period when England's own King George III was widely regarded as awkward and unfashionable, Wealthy ladies and gentlemen sometimes had the mortification of seeing their domestics equal or outdo them in putting on airs. The period abounds with stories of servants who were indistinguishable from those they served. George Bernard Shaw's Professor Henry Higgins accomplished nothing with Eliza Doolittle that many of her class could not have done on their own, given the examples and the opportunity. And naturally, all this opened the door to various types of fraud. In London, where genteel folk were often obliged to engage strangers as servants and were dependent on testimonials, a brisk trade in false references arose. For a fee, a common swindler would impersonate a former master by donning a fine coat and adopting the appropriate air, and give a glowing account to a prospective employer. In 1771, a young woman who had served as a lady's maid at the court of St. James was transported to the southern colonies for theft. With her knowledge of court names and court manners and a few stolen gems to add to her credibility, she passed herself off in Virginia and South Carolina as Queen Charlotte's sister. She was invited into the homes of the best gentry, and American planters vied to kiss her hand before she was exposed as an impostor. A truly horrifying story that became a proverb for the unwary was that of Sir Samuel Morland, a baronet, who in the late 17th century was duped into marrying a beautiful, demure, and well-dressed young lady after meeting her just once in Hyde Park. He believed her to be a wealthy and virginal heiress, but she proved instead to be someone or other's discarded mistress, now fallen on hard times. This sort of fraud worked best in London, where the anonymity of the big city provided additional cover for the imposture. So all of this worked to the advantage of a chameleon-like character such as Stephen Sayre. London had everything, and everything it had could be obtained by wits alone if one were willing to overcome certain scruples. And Stephen did overcome them, and I don't have time to tell about it in detail, but he managed, in the end, he managed to work his way up the ladder, at one point living with a prostitute who he pimped for, but he kept it a secret. And at the same time, he was elected a sheriff of London because he got very active in city politics. And he managed to keep the appearance of a wealthy man through the means I've described in others that are equally unlovely. And he became a notable patriot who was associated with John Wilkes and championed American rights. And just before the Revolution, a few months before the Revolution started, he finally seemed to achieve it all because he married a woman with aristocratic connections. She was a kinswoman of Lord Rockingham. She was a wealthy heiress, and she was 10 years older than him, which in those days, a lot of fortune hunters liked that because they didn't want kids. So he was in his late 30s by then. So he unfortunately, his own personality did him in because he was such a kind of curious person, always getting involved in crazy schemes, that he became the first American ever to be locked up in the Tower of London, when a few months into the Revolution, he was involved in a crazy plot to kidnap George III and lock him up in the tower. You'll have to read about it in the book, but I will say they didn't find any evidence, unsurprisingly, so he was let out after about 5 days. And eventually he joined the American Diplomatic Corps on the continent, which I don't think they liked too much. John Adams kept complaining that he was going around with no credentials saying, I represent the United States at various courts. But I want to finish up just by saying that one of the really interesting things for me that was highlighted for me in recreating colonial Americans in their original capital city was that it reveals just how British Americans still were in cultural terms just before independence. And it reminds us that the American Revolution really was a political conflict and a civil war rather than a nationalist movement. And even people who supported independence felt it very at home with London lifestyles, and culturally at heart they were still English in many ways. And because colonial Americans felt so at home in London, because they didn't observe London as outsiders the way I had hoped when I started the project, I ended up having to assess them through London eyes, right at the eve of independence. And it was fascinating to see that how far they were from the homespun farmers that we picture when we think of our colonial period. And instead they were a very complex people, rich and poor, sophisticated and plain, black and white, free and unfree, and as often decadence as innocence abroad. Thank you.
Do you have questions?
Fairly simple question. I'm just curious, is because the Americans, people from the what we know as the United States now are over there, what term was used in society, whether polite or otherwise, to describe the people from the colonies? Were they colonists? Were they colonials? Were they Americans? Were they, how did?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question, because sometimes they were referred to as Americans, and more as the revolution came on, because the idea of the conflict obviously created an idea of America. But they were just as likely to be referred to as colonists or coming from their particular colony. So a Pennsylvanian or South Carolinian or whatever. And in fact, they tended to still think in that way too. And people who were studying at the Inns of Court didn't write, when they signed in to register, they wouldn't sign, John Rutledge American. They'd sign it, John Rutledge of South Carolina in America, or whatever. And the West Indians did the same thing too. They'd say, of Jamaica in America. And that was still considered part of America, as it should have been. Are there any other questions? No, I've answered every thought that people could have.
Those of us who have read the book feel that we've gained a whole set of new insights and will probably want to go back and read it again. And those who haven't read it, I think, will be rushing straight to the stand at the back to hopefully buy a copy. I can recommend it as an absolutely fantastic read. I have a couple of big thank yous, as well as to Julie for coming all this way. I think she changed planes something like 4 times on her way from Dundee.
It's not easy to get to Charleston.
Firstly to Tricia from the Library Society, the archivist, who has pulled together a huge wealth of fascinating material from the archives to back up some of the arguments and descriptions in Julie's book, and those are in the cabinets at the back, so please do take a moment to go and browse through those. Principal ingredient are our designers for our wonderful invitations and posters and things, and Igor Jokic, the creative director, is here, and we're really grateful to him for his huge support of Wide Angle series. Rob from the Library Society is probably the key point person for so many things here, so it all couldn't really happen without him. It also couldn't happen, obviously, without Anne, and Debbie, and Janice, and Carol, and all the staff here, and Gloria at the South Carolina Historical Society as well, who's giving great backing today. Thibaut, thank you for filming this very much. So we will be putting this on the web, so you'll be able to watch it, or tell your friends to watch it if they haven't seen it yet. And yes, so please come and get Julie to sign your book or buy a new one. And thank you very, very much for coming. And please come to more Wide Angle talks.